This video is brought to you by NewsVoice. The news has broken. Almost all US media is owned by just a handful of big corporations. Also, fake news is a huge problem, and just finding something unbiased can be hard. NewsVoice is revolutionizing the news landscape. It's an app that gives you a personalized newsfeed by aggregating major news sites, as well as international and independent media, giving some much-needed balance. Each news story shows multiple sources, which are all tagged with their bias and perspective. The news affects almost everything in our daily lives. What we hear and read shapes which persons we trust, what we eat, what we buy, how we vote, even how we think. NewsVoice is created by its readers as you can upvote stories that you find interesting so more people will see them. It's essentially a democratized platform for the news. Plus, it saves you time. You get all the news and all the sources in one app so that you can stay better informed. And it's also totally free. Anyway, get started with NewsVoice today for free through the link below. It's available on both Google Play and the App Store. And let's get into it.
Our country is in the midst of a great national trial, unlike any we have ever faced before.
Nous sommes en guerre sanitaire, certes.
I've developed mild symptoms of the coronavirus. I've taken a test that has come out positive.
Oggi registriamo 10.000 vittime, abbiamo superato 10.000 vittime.
Deswegen lassen Sie mich sagen, es ist ernst. Nehmen Sie es auch ernst.
Todos los trabajadores de actividades no esenciales deberán quedarse en casa en las próximas 2 semanas.
We've all seen the pictures online of people who seem to think they're invincible. Well, you're not. Enough is enough. Go home and stay home.
Country after country, the spread of COVID-19 is paralyzing an enormous part of the world's economy. To curb the spread of the virus, states are decreeing all kinds of extraordinary measures, including the confinement of entire populations in their homes, border closures, and the suspension of most commercial and industrial activity. Obviously, this whole situation is gonna have economic consequences, huge ones. Consequences that can even reach professional sport.
Barça's staff is reduced. FC Barcelona's squad confirmed on Monday that they have accepted a 70% pay cut while the state of emergency continues due to coronavirus. Europa Press.
We're talking about a picture where we start to see headlines like this.
Economic shutdown and confinement leave 240,000 companies on the brink of bankruptcy. 4 out of 10 Spanish companies are making losses. They're the most vulnerable if the freeze on the country's production system is prolonged. El Confidencial.
The problem with pressing this kind of nuclear button that suddenly paralyzes the economic and social activity of an entire country is not only does it translate into the immediate damage that comes with having companies closed down completely, but we also do not have the remotest idea how long it's going to take us to recover, nor what the final consequences are going to be once we've defeated the virus. And let's not fool ourselves. Governments need to be cautious, and they won't lift the extraordinary measures they have taken all at once. Instead, they will do so little by little to avoid a second wave of infection. And the safest way may be for some restrictions to be kept in place until a vaccine or effective treatment is found. This is exactly what's happening now in Asian countries that seem to have COVID-19 under control. Many of the restrictions affecting public places such as cinemas, restaurants, hotels, and shopping centers will remain in place. And that's not all. In China, they're restricting entry to the country and cancelling most international flights. In Taiwan, quarantine for people returning to the country is mandatory, and ignoring it means fines of up to $30,000. Access for non-residents, as in Hong Kong and Singapore, has been virtually vetoed. For their part, in South Korea, foreigners can enter, but they must comply with a quarantine of 14 days in an apartment or hotel room. Well, everything indicates that we will also see these kinds of measures later throughout the rest of the world. In other words, economic damage could drag on for quite a long time. On the other hand, for many industries, the damage is already done, and returning to normality will require a titanic effort.
The tourism sector needs on average about 19.4 months to recover from epidemics, more so than the 11.5 months needed to recover from terrorist attacks. Aditya Koala, Fidelity Fund manager.
And of course, the governments themselves aren't going to get away scot-free either. If there's one thing we've learned over the last few decades, it's that economic crises often result in huge, gigantic mountains of public debt, and this time it's not going to be any different. Many countries will register such large budget deficits throughout 2020 that this in itself could lead to a new financial crisis, and that's why we get news stories like this one.
The ECB pulls out its bazooka and breaks all asset purchase records in a week. The Economist.
To give you an idea, the European Central Bank has prepared all the heavy artillery it has to prevent risk premiums from countries like Spain or Italy from soaring into the stratosphere. You see, in order to deal with this crisis and make it easier for European governments to borrow at reduced rates, the European Central Bank has launched a program to buy public and private debt with a budget of 750 billion euros. In the week of the 23rd of March 2020 alone, the European Central Bank bought assets of about 39 billion euros, more than $40 billion. This is the highest weekly level of debt purchase in its entire history. In other words, despite all the discussion of bailouts in Italy or Spain, the truth is that the European Central Bank is already rescuing the European countries most affected by the crisis. Now, wait a second. Clearly, the crisis is not limited to the old continent. In fact, at the time of making this video, the country with the most coronavirus infections on the planet was none other than the United States. And this brings up some questions. What are the consequences of the spread of the virus? And how does the United States plan to deal with the looming crisis? Did you know that the United States just launched the biggest rescue program in history? Well, listen up.
A real slap in the face.
In a past video here on VisualPolitik, we told you how, for weeks, the government of Spain completely ignored the existence of coronavirus. And this went on until, of course, it was too late to stop the spread. Well, something very, very similar happened in the United States. And of course, when events evolved, they did not evolve very differently. With more than 500,000 infected, the United States has the highest number of cases worldwide and the highest growth rate.
I want all Americans to be prepared for difficult days ahead. We're going to go through a tough few weeks. Donald Trump.
To give you an idea, an Imperial College report has determined that if no measures had been taken, coronavirus would have ended the lives of more than 2 million Americans. Even now, after measures such as confinement, travel restrictions, and the closure of schools, universities, and workplaces have been put in place, the White House's leading scientific advisors estimate that this pathogen is, at best, going to end the lives of more than 100,000 Americans. Of course, the economic consequences are already beginning to be felt. At the beginning of March, it took 15 days for US stock exchanges to record the quickest crash in their entire history. In just over 15 days, the S&P 500, the index that brings together the 500 largest listed companies in the United States, fell more than 30% from its highest levels. Financial firms such as Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Morgan Stanley expect the US economy to fall into recession and have recorded GDP falls. Morgan Stanley, for example, expects the US economy to shrink in the second quarter of the year between 24 and 30% of GDP compared to the same quarter in 2019. These are figures that have never been seen before. And for the moment, unemployment data is not exactly optimistic.
Over 10 million Americans applied for unemployment benefits in March as the economy collapsed. A record 6.65 million people filed new jobless claims in the week that ended March 28th. Washington Post.
10 million people in a single month. We are talking about a job destruction figure that is unprecedented, largely because the economy has never stopped in such a way before. All this also comes at a time when many companies have taken on a lot of debt in recent years thanks to low interest rates, to such an extent that in the United States, corporate debt is at its highest level in the last 40 years. And obviously, one of the risks that exists if the health crisis lasts too long is that many companies are going to see their turnover fall sharply. They're going to show losses, and then many might have trouble repaying all of those outstanding debts. It stands to reason that the damage will be greater the longer it takes to overcome this health crisis. But the truth is, we don't know how long it will take or how the recovery will look. Whether it will come in the form of a V, U, or W shape on a graph, nobody can say. What we do know from earlier precedents is that the risk of permanent damage is high. For example, it is known that during the so-called Spanish flu outbreak, which killed more than 500,000 Americans, the hardest hit areas experienced a relative decline in employment, industrial production, and bank assets over the subsequent few years. Then we have the case of major natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, which is obviously not an epidemic, but was an external shock that caused similar effects to some extent. Well, after the impacts of Katrina, the lack of initial reaction caused employment to collapse by more than 30%, and 2 years after the event, barely half of the decline in economic activity had been recovered. The fact is that during the month of March 2020, all economic indicators have begun to fall strongly in the United States. Consumption, investment, exports. As has happened in Europe, the economy is shutting down to try and contain the coronavirus crisis and mitigate its effects. The question now is, how do we avoid a big economic crisis, or rather, how can we overcome this bump without excessively grave economic damage? Well, take a look at this.
I think this is the part that we really need to take personal responsibility for. Saturday, I had a little low-grade fever.
The mother of all bailouts.
After a quick and near unanimous agreement between Republicans and Democrats, both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, Donald Trump signed the law that will ensure the biggest bailout in US history on March the 28th. $2.2 trillion, 10% of GDP, in order to cope with the economic consequences of the coronavirus.
No economic policy can fully end the hardship. This isn't even a stimulus package. It is emergency relief. It is emergency relief. That's what this is. Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader.
Important day. I'll sign the single biggest economic relief package in American history, and I must say, or any other package, by the way. It's twice as large as any relief ever signed. It's $2.2 billion, but it actually goes up to $6.2 potentially $billion. $trillion.
Now, I know what many of you are wondering, but Simon, what exactly is this huge amount of money going towards? Well, let's break it down. First, over $300 billion is going to be spent sending checks to the vast majority of US citizens. Yep, paper checks. Specifically, every person who earns less than $75,000 a year is going to receive a check for $1,200 and $500 per child. In this way, a family of 4 that earns less than $150,000 a year will receive checks worth $3,400 to compensate for the damage caused by the crisis. If they earn more, the amount is progressively reduced. Then, just over $200 billion goes towards extending the right to unemployment insurance, the number of people who can apply for it, the time during which it can be obtained, and also the number of payments to be received over the next 4 months has been increased. And take note of this one. The bailout also suggests that insurers will have to bear the costs of this disease. The fundamental idea is that families do not cut their consumption levels, even if it's at the expense of the public budget.
$6.2 trillion. I've never signed anything with a T on it. I don't know if I can handle this one, Mitch. We can't chicken out at this point, can we?
For small and medium-sized businesses, a $360 billion line in equity loans is opened up. That is, concessional-held loans that can be partially cancelled if certain requirements, such as maintaining the number of employees and payments to suppliers, are met. For large companies, this amount increases to $500 billion. However, in this case, large corporations will have to meet some requirements, such as suspending share buyback programs, and the process will be closely evaluated by a monitoring committee. Finally, the plan includes more than $125 billion for hospitals, drugs, and medical equipment, and $339 billion to support the fight against coronavirus at the state and municipal government level. These are the main measures of the largest rescue package in US history, the plan with which the Trump administration hopes to mitigate the damage caused by coronavirus. Perhaps the biggest problem with this package is that the United States has entered this crisis without doing its homework. So let me explain. The Trump administration had projected a public deficit of just over $1 trillion for this year, 2020. That is almost 5% of GDP. A gigantic hole, especially considering that the US economy has been growing for more than 10 years. Well, the thing is now that with this rescue package and the damage that the crisis could cause to the public coffers, the deficit is going to skyrocket to levels not seen since World War II, levels that could be between 15 and 20% of GDP. To give you an idea, Morgan Stanley's recent estimates suggest that during 2020 and 2021, the US government's public deficit will amount to nearly $5 trillion, virtually the size of Japan's entire economy, which is the third largest economy on the planet after the United States and China. In other words, the US national debt could exceed 125% in just 2 years. The question is, how is it going to be financed? Well, the Federal Reserve is going to play a key role. It's already announced that it's going to buy government bonds like there's no tomorrow. And that's what explains why headlines like this start to appear.
Coronavirus sparks US dollar dilemma for China as Federal Reserve ramps up easing. China is the world's second largest holder of US government debt with about $1.1 trillion worth of US Treasury bonds in its foreign reserves. As the US Federal Reserve scales up monetary easing, pushing down bond yields, some analysts have asked whether Beijing should sell its US Treasury holdings. SCMP.
So are we facing a turning point in global geopolitics? Could coronavirus mean a new transfer of influence from the West to the East? Will Trump's plan to rescue the US economy actually work? These are some of the key questions that need answers. And let us know what you think in the comments below. And I really do hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit like if you did. And don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our friends at Reconsider Media. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. And as always, thank you for watching.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.